welcome to the tutorial demonstrating how to work the crocheted stitches to create the underlying fabric for this beautiful reversibly embroidered scarf. For more information about this project beyond the crocheting, please see my earlier video about my participation in Season 9 of KnitStars. To get started, you'll need three things: a crochet hook. The pattern calls for an F hook, which is a 3.75 millimeter hook. You can see that there. Merino weight fingering. This happens to be a little sample of Koken Yarns' fingering weight in the beautiful colorway Dolly, which she dyed exclusively for KnitStars. And you'll need a reversible marker, a removable marker. For the purposes of this demonstration, I've actually bumped up to an Aran weight so it's easier for you to see my stitches. And I'll also be using an I hook or a 5.5 millimeter hook. To get started, what we'll do is create a slip knot. To do that, take the tail of your yarn, so the end here, and just make a loop, placing it over the body. So it looks like that. So here's the tail. It swoops over the top of the body of the yarn. Go ahead and pick up that loop, take the body of the yarn and place it through the loop and create a second loop that looks like this, kind of like a lasso. Take your crochet hook and put it through that second loop, pick up the body and the tail and pull them in opposite directions so that the crochet hook has one loop on it like this. Let's go through that just one more time. So here's the tail of the yarn. We're just going to make a loop, placing the tail over the body, like that. Pick that loop up, take the body of the yarn, and place it through the first loop you created. And it is through that second loop that you place your crochet hook, pulling taut on tail and body in opposite directions. Once you've got that done, pat yourself on the back. You've done the first step. I'd now like to show you how to anchor your yarn. Taking the yarn from the hook, not the tail, but the part that's actually attached to your yarn, your skein here, put your ring finger on your hook and run that yarn over your ring finger in between your ring and your middle finger. So it's like this. You'll then pivot your hand so that the yarn is now like that. Duck your middle and pointer fingers under like this, and go ahead and grab a hold of your tail. Your pointer is now able to act as counter pressure as you're working your stitches. So let's show that one more time here. Here comes ring, yarn goes over ring, over pinky, and in between ring finger and middle. Go ahead and wave like that. Place middle and pointer underneath the yarn and go ahead and grab the tail with your thumb and your middle fingers. And there you have the pointer really acting as a nice point of pressure as you work your stitches. We're now ready to work 17 chain stitches. So here I am, I'm holding on to the slip knot with my middle finger and my thumb, and I'm using my pointer to provide guidance and pressure as I take my hook underneath the yarn, turn it slightly so that the tip of the hook grabs a hold of the yarn, and I just slide that through the slip stitch that was on the hook previously. Let's do that again. Under the yarn, pivot, pull it through. So under, pivot, pull. Under, pivot, pull. Just keep repeating that a total of 17 times. You may find that you're focusing so much on the technique that you're not counting your stitches. Let me just pause and show you what to do if that happens. Each one of these loops here counts as a stitch. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I have 10. You don't get credit for the one that's on your hook. That was the slip knot essentially that you had made earlier. So we've got 10 stitches, not including this loop on my hook. That means we need 7 more. Now you may have noticed that I've taken my middle finger and my thumb. I'm no longer holding all the way down here at the chain. I've moved closer to my hook, and I'm going to make those last 7. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there's 7. So now we have a total of 17 stitches that we've chained. This will become the foundation for our future stitches of single crochet. Before we work our foundation row, let's just take a moment to appreciate what we've already achieved. We've got our 17 stitch chain that has this beautiful braid on the front of it. If you rock that braid over so it's facing away from you, you'll notice that there are these beautiful bumps, these spine stitches, I like to think of them as, that are supporting the braid. It's into those spine stitches that we're going to be working our foundation row. To do that, we're going to skip the first spine stitch, the first bump that's closest to your hook. We're going to skip that one and work into the second one. So to do that, take the tip of your hook and place it through that bump, that spine stitch, if you will, and put your hook right through. Hook goes under the yarn, slight pivot, grab your yarn with the tip of your hook and pull up a loop. Under your yarn again, pivot, and pull your yarn through the 2 loops on your hook. And that is your first single crocheted stitch. Well done. Okay, now we're going to the next spinal bump right here. Just as before, put the tip of your hook underneath that. Under your yarn, pivot your hook, and pull up a loop. 2 loops now are on your hook. Under your yarn, slight pivot, pull the yarn through the 2 loops. Now you'll notice what I'm doing here is I'm very carefully supporting my work here with my thumb and my middle finger, and my pointer is providing nice counter pressure as I'm doing this work. So see where thumb and pointer are? Right next to the spinal bump that you're going into. So hook goes into the spinal bump like that. Under your yarn, pivot the hook, pull up a loop. Under your yarn, pivot, pull a loop through the 2 loops. Here we go again. Under the spinal bump, under your yarn, pull up a loop. Pull up through 2 loops again. So now you're working across, and you may be finding that this is going swimmingly, or perhaps your spinal bumps are just impossible to get your hook under. No worries. Grab a slightly larger hook. So if you were working on an F hook, grab a G hook and chain those 17 stitches again with your G hook. Then go ahead and put that G hook to the side, grab your F hook, the slightly smaller hook, and start doing what we're doing here, working on our foundation row. So that's just a good hint to have in your back pocket, a little helpful hint here. If you're finding it difficult to get into those spinal bumps, just chain with a slightly larger hook and then drop back down to actually work your foundation row. So you see I'm making this succession of single crocheted stitches all the way along my chain to the very end. So we'll have, when we've finished, 16 single crocheted stitches on our 17 chain beginning. So remember, we skipped the 1 stitch when we got started, allowing us to work 16 single crocheted stitches all the way across. And here we are at the first one. Sometimes this can look a little wonky. This is where we did our slip knot to get started, but just like with the other ones, you'll go into that spinal bump with the tip of your hook under your yarn, grab a loop, pull it up, and then pull your yarn through both of those loops. And here you have your first row, your foundation row of single crochet. Now that we've finished the foundation row, here's what we'll do for the second and all subsequent rows. You'll chain 1. So remember, under the yarn goes your hook, slight pivot, grab the yarn and pull that through. So your very first step to beginning any row is doing a chain 1. You'll then turn your work, and we'll begin single crocheting across all 16 of our stitches. This will be a little bit easier. It's almost like your underlying crochet is telling you, put your hook here. You see that little hole that's underneath the braid of your foundation row, the top of your foundation row? That's where you're going to put your hook. Grab your yarn, pull up a loop, grab your yarn again, and go through both loops. Let's do that again. So here's a little hole that's underneath the braid. That's where you'll put your hook. So into the little hole, grab your yarn, pivot, pull up a loop, grab your yarn through both loops. So into the hole, pull up a loop, and then underneath both. And you'll repeat that all the way across. You'll find that this row and all subsequent rows beyond your foundation row are so much easier because you're not dealing with that little spinal column of bumps. The crocheted stitches are a lot more forgiving for inserting your hook. So again, under both legs of your braid, grab your yarn, pull through the loops. I'm going to work this all the way across. And here's our last stitch. The braid can sometimes look a little unusual. You want to make sure that you put your hook through both legs of your braid for your 16th stitch. So that's what it looks like. There's the loop from before. Here are both legs of your braid. Under the yarn, pivot your hook, pull up a loop, and then grab those two loops. Now that you've finished your second row, what I'd like you to do, and you'll see this in the pattern, is you're going to go ahead and put your removable marker into that stitch at the very beginning of the row there on the right. And if you have forgotten to do this, you can always remember that your right side is facing when your tail is on the right. So right side is facing when the tail is on the right side of your work. This is important for when we begin our embroidery adventure together. So go ahead and put that marker in, and that can be useful for when we start embroidering. But for now, let's pop right back into where we were. We finished our second row. Let's do that chain one more time. I always think of this as like the elevator up to the next floor. So we take the elevator up a floor, we turn our work, and we begin single crocheting all the way across again. And you'll see that your left hand, your non-dominant hand, which for me is my left hand, is just as busy in the process as your dominant hand, which for my case is my right hand. I'm using my thumb and my middle finger to support my work as I go along, and I'm using my pointer finger to give myself a little bit more yarn. So the slack is controlled by my pointer finger, and my middle finger and my thumb are providing the support. And this will come more and more easily to you the more you practice it, like anything else. I'll just stop there for a second and remind you that last stitch can look a little wonky. Don't worry, just make sure you put your hook underneath both legs of the braid, that last braid, pull up your loop, go through both stitches. So there's our third row. And just like before, you're going to chain one, turn your work, and keep right on going. Now in the pattern, you'll notice that I do give a gauge. You may be thinking, okay, well, gauge doesn't matter for this kind of work. Well, if you're going to be doing the embroidery from here, gauge can become important because you want stitches that are tight enough to support the embroidery that we're going to do. So gauge in the pattern is 15 single crocheted stitches and 18 rows across. So you'll pull out your handy dandy tape measure, and you'll take a quick measure to see where you are with this. I've embroidered this swatch, so it's a little bit smaller than the 2.5 inches that the pattern calls for. But you want to be pretty much spot on for both your row and your stitch gauge. And so if you're not, you can adjust your hook accordingly. If you're too large, if your stitches are too loose, please go ahead and drop down to an E hook. You can find that information here on the hook itself. So I recommend beginning with an F hook, which is a 3.75 millimeter hook. You could drop down to an E, or if you're too tight, if your swatch that you're creating here is too loose or too tight, pardon me, you can go up to a slightly larger hook. So keep that in mind. All of the information about gauge is in the pattern, which are in the show notes for this episode. You can find that there. The last thing I wanted to demonstrate today is how to count your rows of crochet versus your rows of circles. I've completed 6 rows of single crochet for this little swatch, and that has created 3 rows of circles, as I call it in the pattern. You can see this first row right here that was created by our foundation row and our second row of single crochet. This next row of pretty circles, eyelets almost if you will, that goes along there, that was created by our third and fourth row of single crochet, and this 5th and 6th row created our 3rd row of eyelets. For the purposes of our project, our embroidery project, it will be so much easier for you to count rows of circles rather than rows of crochet. So again, here were 6 rows of single crochet that created 3 rows of circles. You can count them 1, 2, 3. The pattern that's provided as a part of KnitStars will get into the exact specifics of how many you'll need to create in order to work our reversible embroidered project. And so I hope that you'll join me for that as a part of the KnitStars adventure, where we will take this basic swath of single crochet and turn it into this beautifully embroidered reversible piece. I hope today helped. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to DM me. You can easily find me at Carolyn@Bloom Handmade Studio or on Instagram @Bloom Handmade Studio. I hope today's tutorial was both useful and an indication of how I like to teach patiently and methodically, and sparks your interest in taking this class with me through KnitStars. Thanks for tuning in.